The morning of September 14, 2003, began the way most September mornings do in Coshocton County, Ohio. A thin mist clung to the Tuscarawas River Valley. The maples along County Road 621 had just begun their slow turn toward amber. Somewhere in a modest ranch-style home on the eastern edge of a small town that most people in Columbus had never heard of, a woman named Renee Hartwell, 31 years old, a mother of two, a part-time dental office receptionist, and a woman described by every neighbor who ever knew her as the kind of person who remembered your birthday without being reminded. That woman made her children breakfast, watched the school bus pull away from the end of her gravel driveway, turned back toward her house, and was never seen again. Her coffee cup sat on the kitchen counter. It was still warm when the first officer arrived. A purse, a wallet, a car in the driveway with a quarter tank of gas and the driver's door left unlocked. A woman who had no known enemies, no outstanding financial pressures, no history of disappearing, gone in the space of an ordinary morning. And the question that would haunt Coshocton County for the next 19 years, the question that deputies, neighbors, journalists, and Renee's own children would ask in the silence of their worst nights, was not simply where she had gone. It was who, standing right beside her, already knew the answer. Coshocton, Ohio sits in the eastern central part of the state, cradled by wooded hills and river bends that give the region a kind of quiet, almost cinematic beauty that photographers notice on autumn drives and that residents tend to take for granted. The county seat bears the same name as the county itself, and in 2003, its population hovered just under 12,000 people. Main Street still had a hardware store where the owner knew your last name. The high school football team drew half the town to Friday night games. The local paper, the Coshocton Tribune, ran wedding announcements and church fundraisers, and the occasional police blotter item about a traffic stop or a domestic disturbance. It was not a place where women vanished. The Hartwell home sat about 4 miles east of downtown on County Road 621, a 2-lane road that wound past cornfields and modest properties, past a volunteer fire station, and a small Methodist church with a marquee sign that still read Fall Festival, Sept 20th, on the morning Renee disappeared. The house itself was a single-story ranch, built sometime in the early 1980s, with vinyl siding that had once been white and was now the color of old cream. There was a tire swing in the side yard, a small garden plot where Renee grew tomatoes and zucchini, a concrete birdbath that the neighborhood kids had apparently once tried to carry away as a prank and had not gotten very far with. By every account, it was the house of a family that was trying, not thriving exactly, but trying. Renee Hartwell, born Renee Marie Caldwell, in Newcomerstown, Ohio, in 1972, had married Gary Allen Hartwell in June of 1996. Gary was 36 in September of 2003, 5 years her senior, a man who had worked in a variety of jobs over the years. A stint at a pipe fittings manufacturer in Coshocton, a brief period driving delivery trucks for a regional distributor, and most recently, since the spring of 2002, a position doing grounds maintenance for a property management company that handled several apartment complexes in the area. He worked mornings, typically starting around 6:30 and finishing by early afternoon. His coworkers described him as quiet, competent, not particularly social. He kept to himself in the way that some men do, not offensively, just measurably. The couple had 2 children, Kaylee, who was 7 years old in September of 2003, and Marcus, who had just turned 5 that July. Both attended Coshocton Elementary. Both rode the bus that stopped at the end of their gravel driveway at 7:48 each morning. Those who knew the family well, and in a community that size, there were several, said the marriage had been showing its strain for at least a year. Nothing dramatic. No public arguments, no visible bruising, no police calls to the address. Just the kind of quiet erosion that neighbors notice in retrospect, when they're standing in their own kitchens trying to remember the last time they saw the couple together and smiling at the same time. Renee's closest friend, a woman named Donna Pressler who lived 3 properties down on the same road, would later tell investigators that Renee had called her the evening of September 13th, the night before she disappeared. The call was brief, Donna recalled. Renee had mentioned that she and Gary had argued earlier that evening. She had not gone into specifics. She had said, according to Donna's recollection, something along the lines of, "I'm tired, Donna. I'm just really tired of all of it." Donna had told her to get some sleep. She had said they'd talk more in the morning. They never did. The morning of September 14th moved in ordinary rhythms. It was a Sunday, which meant Gary was not scheduled for work. He was, according to his own account given to deputies later that day, home until approximately 9:15 in the morning, at which point he said he drove to a gas station on Chestnut Street to pick up a newspaper and a bottle of motor oil, then proceeded to a friend's property on Township Road 4 where he helped the friend, a man named Dale Osborne, move some equipment from a storage shed. Gary said he returned home at approximately 12:30 in the afternoon. He said he found the door unlocked and the house empty. He said he assumed Renee had taken the children somewhere, perhaps to her sister's house in Newcomerstown or to the grocery store. But the children were not with Renee. The children, as it turned out, had spent the night at Gary's mother's house in town and were not due back until late afternoon. Gary knew this. He had driven them there himself the previous evening. So when Gary said he assumed Renee had taken the children somewhere, investigators noted this. They wrote it down. They underlined it later, quietly, in the margin of a yellow legal pad. The coffee cup, as first responding Deputy Carl Mayers would note in his incident report, was positioned near the right side of the kitchen sink. There was approximately 4 ounces of coffee remaining in the mug. A partial plate of toast sat beside it, 1 piece eaten, 1 untouched. The refrigerator door was closed. The television in the living room was off. The back door, which led to a small concrete patio and then to a yard that backed up against a wooded tree line, was unlocked but not open. Renee's purse was on the kitchen table. Her cell phone, a simple flip phone, unremarkable for 2003, was inside the purse. Her wallet, containing $43 in cash and her driver's license, was inside the purse. Her car, a 1999 Chevrolet Cavalier in dark green, was in the driveway. The tire swing in the side yard hung absolutely still. There was no wind that morning. Gary Hartwell called 911 at approximately 12:58 in the afternoon. His voice, on the recording that would later be obtained by investigators, was measured, not frantic, not tearful, measured in the way of a man reporting a mechanical problem, a flat tire, a leaking pipe. He said his wife was missing. He said he did not know where she had gone. He said he needed someone to come to the house. Deputy Mayers arrived at 1:17. He later noted, in a written summary, that Gary Hartwell met him at the end of the driveway rather than at the front door. He noted that Gary was wearing clean clothes, khaki pants, a dark blue flannel shirt. He noted that Gary's hands, when they shook, were dry. By 3 o'clock on the afternoon of September 14th, 2003, the Coshocton County Sheriff's Office had made contact with Renee's sister, Linda Caldwellmore, in Newcomerstown. Linda had not heard from Renee that day. She drove to Coshocton within the hour, and the image of her walking up that gravel driveway, gravel crunching under her shoes, her hands pressed together in front of her as though she were already praying, was one that several deputies present that afternoon said they did not forget. A formal missing persons report was filed that same evening. By the following morning, September 15th, a search effort had been organized. The Coshocton County Sheriff's Office coordinated with volunteers, and by 9 o'clock that morning, approximately 40 people had assembled in the parking lot of the Methodist Church on County Road 621 to receive assignments. They searched the wooded area behind the Hartwell property. They searched the fields adjacent to the road. They searched along the Tuscarawas River, walking the banks in groups of 4, scanning the shallow water and the brushy overgrowth at the river's edge. They found nothing. Search and rescue teams from neighboring counties were brought in over the following days. A cadaver-trained dog unit from Muskingum County worked the property and the surrounding acreage on September 17th. The dog alerted in 2 locations, once near the tree line at the back of the property, and once near a small culvert about 300 yards down the road from the house. Both areas were excavated to a depth of approximately 2 feet. Both were negative for human remains. The community response in the early days was everything a small community is capable of. Flyers with Renee's photograph, a smiling woman with light brown hair pulled back in a ponytail, taken at a family cookout the previous summer, appeared in the windows of businesses along Main Street, on the bulletin board at the public library, at the post office, at the diner on 2nd Street where Renee had occasionally had lunch with Donna Pressler on Fridays. The local television news stations in Columbus ran brief segments. The Tribune ran a front-page story. There was a prayer vigil at the Methodist Church that drew over 100 people on the evening of September 18th. And through all of it, Gary Hartwell was present. He stood at the vigil with his head bowed and his children on either side of him, one small hand in each of his larger ones. He spoke to the television cameras when approached, keeping his answers short. He said he just wanted his wife back home. He said the children missed their mother. His eyes in those early interviews were dry. Those who knew him said they understood. Grief takes different forms, they said. Some people cry, some people go still. Gary had always been a private person. Deputies whispered quietly among themselves about things that did not quite settle right. The first inconsistency that investigators flagged involved Gary's stated timeline on the morning of September 14th. He had told deputy mayors that he left the house at approximately 9:15. He said he drove to the gas station on Chestnut Street, then to Dale Osborne's property on Township Road 4. The distance from the Hartwell home to the Chestnut Street gas station was approximately 4.2 miles. The distance from that gas station to Osborne's property on Township Road 4 was approximately 7.8 miles. Investigators drove the route at a normal Sunday morning pace, with a brief stop at the gas station. The drive to Osborne's property would take somewhere in the range of 18 to 22 minutes. Gary told investigators he arrived at Osborne's property at approximately 9:45. That left approximately 8 to 10 minutes unaccounted for, a small window that could have meant anything or nothing, but it was written down. Dale Osborne confirmed that Gary had been at his property. He said Gary had arrived, as far as he could recall, sometime between 9:30 and 10. He was not more specific. He said they worked for a couple of hours. He said Gary seemed fine, normal. He said Gary had left somewhere around noon, which, if Osborne's account was accurate, would have placed Gary's return to the Hartwell home at approximately 12:15, 15 minutes earlier than Gary had reported to deputy mayors. 15 minutes, another small detail, another underlined margin note. The gas station on Chestnut Street had a surveillance camera, as many gas stations did by 2003, but the footage was on a 48-hour overwrite cycle, and by the time investigators thought to request it, 4 days after the disappearance, the footage from the morning of September 14th was gone. Physical evidence from inside the Hartwell home was limited. There were no signs of forced entry at any of the doors or windows. There was no physical evidence of a confrontation inside the house. No overturned furniture, no broken objects, no blood. The partial plate of toast and the half-consumed coffee were the only indicators that Renee had been in the kitchen that morning and had stopped what she was doing before finishing. Investigators noted the position of the toast. They noted that the consumed piece showed a bite pattern suggesting the meal had barely begun. Someone, they reasoned, had pulled Renee away from that breakfast very quickly, or Renee had left it voluntarily in a moment of urgency. But voluntary departures, investigators observed, did not typically leave a purse, a phone, a wallet, and a car behind. The forensic examination of the Hartwell home, conducted on September 16th and 17th by the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation, turned up a single finding of interest: a smear of reddish-brown material on the inner frame of the back door, positioned at approximately waist height on the right side of the frame. The material was collected and submitted for analysis. The results, returned approximately 3 weeks later, were inconclusive. The sample was degraded and insufficient for a definitive blood typing determination. It could not be confirmed as blood. It could not be excluded as blood. It was written into the file, and the file began to thicken. Renee's sister Linda, who had by mid-October essentially moved into the role of family advocate and public face of the search effort, told investigators in a formal interview on October 2nd that Renee had confided in her, several months earlier, that she had been considering leaving Gary. Linda said Renee had mentioned this carefully, obliquely, the way people mention things they are afraid to say directly. She said Renee had asked her, hypothetically, whether Linda thought Renee could afford an apartment on her receptionist's salary. She said Renee had mentioned once that Gary had a bad temper, worse than most people knew. Linda was asked if she had ever witnessed Gary being physically aggressive with Renee. She said she had not directly. By late November of 2003, the active search had wound down. There were no remains. There were no witnesses. There was no definitive physical evidence connecting anyone to a crime. There was only the vanishing, as clean and complete as if Renee Hartwell had simply dissolved into the September air. The case was placed in an inactive status in February of 2004. The file was not closed. Renee was still classified as a missing person, but the active investigative resources had moved on to other matters. Gary Hartwell retained custody of Kaylee and Marcus. The tire swing in the side yard still hung still. The toy truck that Marcus had left on the porch the evening before his mother disappeared still lay on its side, one wheel slowly rusting through the winter. By the spring of 2005, Gary Hartwell and his 2 children had moved. The house on County Road 621 was sold in March of that year to a young couple from Columbus who knew nothing of its history and who, by most accounts, were quite happy in it. Gary relocated the family approximately 60 miles west, to a rental house in Licking County, outside Newark, Ohio. He found work at a landscaping company. He enrolled Kaylee, now 9, and Marcus, now 6, in their new schools. The distance, in miles and in some other harder-to-measure way, seemed to suit Gary Hartwell. Donna Pressler, Renee's friend, still lived on County Road 621. She had not removed the photograph of Renee from her refrigerator door. She had called the sheriff's office, by her own count, 11 times between 2004 and 2007, asking about the status of the investigation, asking whether any new information had come in, asking whether anyone had thought to revisit this detail or that detail she had recalled in the months after Renee's disappearance. The calls were received respectfully. The answers were always some version of the same answer. The case remained open. There was nothing new to report. Renee's sister Linda, who had returned to Newcomerstown and to her own family and her own life, kept a box on the top shelf of her closet. The box contained copies of the original missing persons flyers, still bearing Renee's smiling face from that summer cookout, the ponytail, the easy laugh. It contained the program from the prayer vigil at the Methodist Church. It contained a small notebook in which Linda had written, over several years, the names of investigators she had spoken to, the dates of her calls, the notes she had taken. It contained, in a plastic sleeve, the last photograph she had of herself and Renee together, taken at a family Easter gathering in 2003, 5 months before Renee vanished. For those who have ever carried a grief that no one officially acknowledges, a grief with no grave, no ceremony, no moment of confirmed finality, the weight of what Linda carried in that box is not easily translated into words. It is the weight of an unfinished sentence, of a door that will not quite close. In 2006, Gary Hartwell entered a relationship with a woman named Patricia Soule. They were together for approximately 2 years. Those who knew Patricia during this period would later describe, when asked, a woman who became progressively quieter over the course of that relationship, who had arrived in it as a sociable, outgoing person, and who, by the time it ended, rarely attended social functions and had distanced herself from several close friends. The relationship ended in the summer of 2008. Patricia Soule did not speak publicly about Gary Hartwell for many years. When she eventually did, it was not to a journalist or a television camera. It was to a detective. Kaylee Hartwell, who had been 7 years old when her mother disappeared, turned 16 in 2012. Those who were close to the family during those years, teachers, relatives, neighbors in Newark, described a young woman who was capable and quietly resilient in the way that children who have survived disruption sometimes are. They also described a young woman who drew, extensively, in sketchbooks that she kept to herself. Animals mostly and landscapes. And sometimes in the margins of pages, shapes that looked like houses. Specifically, a house with a tire swing. Marcus, who had been 5 in 2003, had no reliable memories of his mother that he could have identified as such. What he had were feelings, associations without narratives, the emotional residue of an early loss. He was, by his teacher's accounts, a sensitive child. He cried easily and apologized for it. Clears throat. In 2014, Kaylee Hartwell, now 18 and preparing to leave for Columbus State Community College in the fall, had what her Aunt Linda would later describe as a kind of breaking point. Linda did not learn the specifics immediately. What she learned was that Kaylee had called her, late in the evening of an April night in 2014, and had asked whether she could come stay with Linda for a few days. She stayed for 3 weeks. During those 3 weeks, according to Linda, Kaylee talked. She talked about things she had observed as a child, things she had recorded in her memory without having had a context in which to understand them. She talked about an argument she had heard through her bedroom wall the night before she and Marcus went to their grandmother's house, the night of September 13th, 2003. She said the argument had been loud. She said she had heard her father's voice, raised. She said she had heard something hit the wall. She had been 7 years old and she had pulled her blanket up around her ears and she had not told anyone, because at 7 years old in the morning, when your father drives you and your brother to grandma's house with a perfectly composed face and tells you to be good, you don't have a framework for what you witnessed the night before. You file it somewhere. You put it in a part of yourself that is below language. And sometimes, 11 years later, it comes back up. By the spring of 2014, the marriage between Gary Hartwell and a second woman he had briefly married in 2010 had also ended, quietly, in a courthouse filing that cited irreconcilable differences and was processed without fanfare. Gary was, by this point, living alone in a small house in Granville, Ohio. Linda Caldwellmore, following her conversations with Kaylee in April of 2014, did something she had done 11 times before. She called the Coshocton County Sheriff's Office. But this time, she specifically requested to speak with a detective rather than a records clerk. She said she had new information. She said she wanted to talk to someone who would actually listen. She was transferred to Detective Sergeant Andrew Fells, who had joined the sheriff's office in 2009, and who had read the Hartwell file not because it was assigned to him, but because, in the way of certain investigators who take their work personally, he had come across it in a binder of cold cases and had not been able to stop thinking about it. Detective Fells listened. The swing had hung still for 11 years. The file had sat in a cabinet. The coffee cup was long gone, but somewhere in a manila folder with a case number on the tab, there were photographs of it, and those photographs had been waiting in the dark of that cabinet for someone to look at them again with fresh eyes. The trigger, when it came, did not arrive in the form of new forensic technology or a deathbed confession or a surveillance camera that had been overlooked. It arrived in the form of two women, separated by a decade, who had been afraid to speak, and who, finally, had decided to stop being afraid. The first was Kaylee Hartwell herself. The second was Patricia Soule. Detective Fells, after his initial conversation with Linda Caldwellmore in the spring of 2014, requested a formal reinvestigation be authorized by the Coshocton County Sheriff. The authorization was granted in June of 2014. The Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation, the same agency that had processed the forensic evidence in 2003, was brought back in as a supporting agency. A renewed investigative file was opened. Detective Fells began, methodically at the beginning. He re-interviewed Dale Osborne, who was now in his early 60s and still living on Township Road 4. Osborne, speaking to Fells in July of 2014, was more precise than he had been in 2003. He said he had thought about the timeline many times over the years. He said that when Gary Hartwell arrived at his property on September 14, 2003, it had been, he was now fairly confident, closer to 10 o'clock than to 9:30. He said he had recalled this because he had watched a Sunday morning news program that ran from 9 to 10, and Gary had arrived after it ended. If Gary had left the Hartwell home at 9:15, driven 4.2 miles to the gas station on Chestnut Street, completed a brief stop, and then driven 7.8 miles to Osborne's property, and yet had arrived there at approximately 10, the window of unaccounted time expanded from 8 minutes to something closer to 25. 25 minutes, in which Gary Hartwell's location could not be confirmed by any witness. Detective Fells, with the assistance of OB analysts, also revisited the original forensic findings from the house. The inconclusive reddish-brown smear on the back door frame had been photographed, but the original sample, such as it was, no longer existed. What did exist was a detailed scene photograph that the 2003 forensic team had taken. Fells worked with OB to determine whether there were other items from the original processing that might have retained evidentiary value. In September of 2014, 11 years after Renee's disappearance almost to the day, OB analysts re-examined items that had been collected from the Hartwell home and placed in evidence storage in 2003. Items that had never been submitted for testing, because in 2003 the technology or the investigative priority had not been there. Among these items was a work glove, a single glove, found behind the dryer in the Hartwell home's small laundry area during the original 2003 search. It had been collected and logged, and then placed in a brown evidence bag where it had remained for 11 years. The glove was submitted to OB's Trace Evidence Unit. It came back with touch DNA material consistent with two individuals. One profile matched Gary Hartwell, whose DNA was on file from a 2003 sample taken with his consent. The second profile was a partial. It was not sufficient for a database match, but it was not Renee Hartwell's profile. It was not either of the children's profiles. It was an unknown contributor, someone else's biological material, on a glove behind a dryer in a house where a woman had disappeared. Clears throat. Separately, in the fall of 2014, Detective Fells located Patricia Soule, now living in Knox County. He requested a voluntary interview. She agreed. What Patricia Soule told Detective Fells, in a recorded interview conducted at the Knox County Sheriff's Office on November 3, 2014, was this. During her relationship with Gary Hartwell between 2006 and 2008, Gary had, on one occasion when he was angry with her and she had threatened to leave him, said something that she had never reported and had never stopped hearing. He had said, according to Patricia's testimony, "You don't want to go. You don't want to make me deal with that again." She had asked him what he meant by that. He had looked at her, she said, for a long moment. Then he had said, Renee thought she could leave too. Patricia Soule said she had not left that night. She said she had been frightened. She said she had told herself over the following weeks and months that it hadn't meant what she thought it meant, that it was anger talking, that she was misreading it. But she had never forgotten it. And when she heard, through mutual acquaintances in 2014, that a detective had reopened the Hartwell case, she had picked up the phone. He said Renee thought she could leave too. 7 words, held for 6 years in the memory of a woman who had told herself not to trust what she knew. Kaylee Hartwell provided a formal recorded statement in December of 2014. She was 21 years old. She described, in careful and measured language, the argument she had heard through her bedroom wall on the night of September 13, 2003. She described hearing her father's voice. She described hearing, she believed, a sound she had interpreted as a child as something falling or being thrown. She described the way her father had appeared the following morning, calm, composed, organizing their overnight bags, driving them to their grandmother's house. She said, "He kissed me on the top of my head when he dropped me off. I remember it. He always kissed us on the head, and I remember thinking even then, even at 7, something was wrong. I didn't have words for it, but I knew something was wrong." She said she had wanted to tell someone for years. She said she had been afraid of being wrong. She said she had been afraid of destroying what remained of her family. She said she had been afraid of her father, though she had not admitted that to herself until she was an adult. She said, "My mother deserves for someone to know what happened to her." On March 4, 2015, the Coshocton County Prosecutor's Office, working in coordination with Detective Fells and the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation, presented evidence to a grand jury. On March 9, 2015, a grand jury returned an indictment charging Gary Allen Hartwell with 1 count of the removal and concealment of a deceased person, and 1 count related to causing serious harm to another person, charges that, Under Ohio statute, the prosecutor's office had determined were supportable given the evidence assembled, even in the continued absence of Renee Hartwell's remains. Gary Hartwell was arrested on March 11, 2015, at his residence in Granville, Ohio, at approximately 7:40 in the morning. Licking County Sheriff's deputies, coordinating with Coshocton County investigators, knocked on his door as the sun was still low over the eastern hills. A neighbor across the street, who was leaving for work at the time, later told a reporter that Gary Hartwell had come to the door in work clothes, as though he had already been up for some time. He had looked at the deputies without apparent surprise, the neighbor said. He had not spoken for a long moment. Then he had turned and gone back inside, as though to retrieve something, his jacket, it turned out, before being taken into custody. He did not resist. He did not run. He said nothing of significance. The arrest made the local television news in Columbus and Cleveland within hours. The Coshocton Tribune ran the story on its front page the following morning under a headline that simply stated the facts. By the end of the week, the story had been picked up by regional wire services and had spread to a national true crime podcast audience that had, in the intervening years, grown accustomed to cold cases being reopened and suspects finally facing accountability. The community response in Coshocton was precisely the split that such cases always produce. There were those, many of them, for whom the arrest was not a shock at all. These were the neighbors who had whispered to each other in 2003 and had never quite stopped. The people who had noticed the composure, who had done the math on the timeline, who had said to each other, quietly and carefully, that something had never added up. Donna Pressler, when reached by a reporter, said she had known. She said she had known for 12 years. She said knowing and being able to do anything about it were two entirely different things, and that the distance between them was the cruelest distance she had ever crossed. There were also those for whom the arrest was genuinely stunning, coworkers of Gary's in Granville who described a man they had liked, a man who had seemed steady and reliable, a man who had mentioned his children with what appeared to be genuine affection. One coworker told a reporter he felt as though the ground had moved beneath him. He said he kept going back over conversations he and Gary had shared over the years, looking for something that should have told him. He said he could not find it, and that this, in its own way, frightened him more than if he had. Linda Caldwellmore, upon hearing of the arrest, said nothing to journalists for several days. When she did speak briefly to a reporter from the Tribune, she said only that she was glad the truth was moving toward the surface. She said Renee had deserved better. She said her children had deserved better. She said she was going to go home and take the box down from the shelf in her closet and look at the photograph from Easter 2003 and be with her sister for a little while. Gary Allen Hartwell entered a plea of not guilty at his arraignment on March 16, 2015, in the Coshocton County Court of Common Pleas. His attorney, a defense lawyer from Columbus, argued at a preliminary hearing that the evidence against his client was circumstantial, that no body had been located, and that the testimony of a daughter with a long dormant memory and a former girlfriend reporting a remark from 6 years prior did not constitute a reliable evidentiary foundation for the charges. The judge disagreed. Bond was set and not met. Gary Hartwell remained in the Coshocton County Jail. The trial commenced in October of 2015. It lasted 11 days. The prosecution presented the timeline discrepancies, the DNA findings from the work glove, Patricia Soul's testimony about the remark Gary had made, Kaylee's testimony about the argument she had witnessed the night before her mother's disappearance, and the broader pattern of behavior, the lack of emotion, the composed demeanor in the immediate aftermath, the statements that did not quite align with each other or with the established facts. The defense presented character witnesses. It attacked the DNA evidence as inconclusive. It suggested that Renee Hartwell might have left voluntarily, might, somehow, have constructed a disappearance so complete that 11 years of searching had turned up no trace of her anywhere in the world. The jury deliberated for 2 days. On October 22, 2015, the jury returned its verdict. Gary Allen Hartwell was found guilty on both counts. He stood at the defense table as the verdicts were read. His face, according to court observers, was the same face he had always shown, composed, unreadable, the face of a man who had practiced keeping the surface still. He did not speak. He did not look at Kaylee, who was seated in the gallery with her Aunt Linda's hand in hers. He looked, it was said, at a fixed point on the wall, somewhere above and behind the jury box, and he stayed very still, and the room around him was not still at all. Sentencing was conducted in December of 2015. The judge, in delivering the sentence, noted the particular cruelty of a case in which no remains had been found, in which the victim's family had been denied not only justice for 12 years, but the most basic human acknowledgement that their loved one was gone, and that her life had mattered. He sentenced Gary Allen Hartwell to 15 years to life. Renee Hartwell's remains have, as of the writing of this account, never been located. The search for them has not been formally concluded. There is a kind of case that the legal system was not originally designed for, a case built on the accumulated weight of small things, of silences, of what is present in the space around a too-composed face, and a timeline that does not quite hold. The Hartwell case was one of these. It required years and patience, and the courage of 2 women who spoke when speaking was costly, and the particular stubbornness of investigators who chose to keep looking when looking was inconvenient. What it required, above all, was a daughter who was 7 years old when she heard something through her bedroom wall and pulled her blanket up around her ears, and who carried what she heard for 11 years before she found the words and the courage to let it out into the light. Kaylee Hartwell did not get her mother back. No verdict gives a child her mother back. What she got was something narrower and harder one, the formal acknowledgement of a truth she had always, in some small and wordless place inside herself, already known. Renee Marie Hartwell was 31 years old. She grew tomatoes and zucchini. She remembered birthdays. She made toast on a Sunday morning and left one piece untouched, and she deserved a world in which that morning continued, in which the children came home in the afternoon, and the toast was finished and the coffee was drunk, and the September light came through the kitchen window the way it does in Ohio in the fall, amber and quiet, and unaware of what it illuminates. She deserved to be heard. She is heard now. Bell tolls once slowly. If this story stayed with you, if it reminded you that the smallest details carry the heaviest truths, that silence is not always peaceful, and that justice, however long it takes, belongs to those who were never given the chance to ask for it themselves, then share this episode. Subscribe and hit the bell so that the next story reaches you. Because somewhere in a county you may have never heard of, in a file in a cabinet in a building with fluorescent lights and old carpet, there is another case that is waiting. Another woman whose coffee cup sat still on a counter. Another family that kept a box on a shelf. Another daughter who has not yet found her words. Someone somewhere may still be waiting to be heard.